Hi, my name is Reed Silverne. The name of this show is Fed Pride. Reason it's called Fed Pride is because I'm a federal employee, retired, and proud of it. Today for me, it's the 5th of July. It's a Friday. For you, it'll either be a Tuesday at noon or a Wednesday at 6:30 p.m., which is my new times. However, whatever I say today is going to be real obsolete by the time you see it in a week and a half, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks. Because of the timing of this particular taping, it's the same show is going to be on for about 5 weeks before I get back and do another show. So I always have the problem that whatever is big today, whatever is important, whatever is in the news, the Zimmerman trial, whatever it is going to be so boring and obsolete by the time you watch it. It'll be awful. Basically, you are looking through a time machine into the past, watching me talk about something that I think is worth talking about 3 weeks from now, 4 weeks from now, and so on and so forth. So that's basically the bottom line of it. Now, there has been just so much news in the last 3 weeks since I did my last show, or at least taped my last show. It's hard to say what's most important. Among other things, I'm going to take, first of all, I'm going to see if I can get United States of America, our great country. For me, by the way, it's 4th of July weekend. You saw the fireworks last night. And, of course, for you, the 4th of July will be a distant past memory. So what's happened? Well, the Supreme Court issued all of the rest of its sessions not findings, but decisions, all together and all at once. Some of them were of tremendous import, and they finished up with gay marriage and DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act. And basically, they struck down the Defense of Marriage Act, and Prop 8 was reversed on the technicality. And gay people, for good reason, and I'm very happy for them, are very, very happy. And I think that's going to be a big story for 2 or 3 days. In fact, it's almost all over now. But it really suppressed the story from the day before. Because the day before, the same Supreme Court, the Roberts Court, issued a 5-4 decision on the Voting Rights Act, one of the key acts that enfranchised non-whites in this country. Basically, from the Civil War, end of the Civil War, 1865, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation was issued by Lincoln. And, of course, this is a good time to talk about that because we just had the 150th anniversary of the fall of Vicksburg and winning the North winning the Battle of Gettysburg. There's Gettysburg right about there. And all of this happened, within a few days in the middle of July or the beginning of July in 1863. However, the Emancipation Proclamation, what a lot of people don't understand, only applied to slaves in the South. Didn't free slaves in the border states or anywhere else. So what really did that is, I believe, 1866, a couple years later, and even after Lincoln was no longer or had been assassinated, there was 2 amendments to the Constitution, or 3 all told. The 13th was the freeing of the slaves. The 14th basically gave the same rights, equal rights to anybody who was born in the United States. And I've done shows about that, about attempts to try to distinguish between children of illegal aliens born in the United States and people who have been 2, 3, 4, 5 generations or Native Americans who got their citizenship only in 1924, but have actually been born on the their ancestors have been born on the land of the United States for 12,000 years, who knows how many thousands of years, long before the Bible was written or even thought about. So we have this situation where around the Reconstruction lasted until about 1877. There was an election, and a guy who wanted to re-enfranchise the South, and it was slowly being re-enfranchised anyway, and get rid of all these rights that freemen had and so on and so forth, or at least accommodate the Southerners. And there was a kind of a reversal around 1877 that was encoded in the 1890s and early noughts, 1900s. And that's today called Jim Crow, which is basically segregation, separate but equal. Schools were segregated by race. Bathrooms were segregated by race. There was if somebody who was non-white wanted to go into a store, they had to go to the back entrance. It was an awful thing. It was not equal. And basically, a bunch of strategies were used to keep non-whites from voting so that the franchise, especially in the South, but also right here in Arizona and some other places that had large minority populations that were not necessarily African American, and basically segregated housing and segregated schools, but mostly kept non-whites from voting. And how did they do that? And basically, the main way they did that was through a poll tax, which was basically ignored for the poor whites and enforced on the blacks and other non-whites, African Americans and other non-whites, and also literacy tests where white people were asked to sign their name, and if they could vote without a problem, or at least put an X. And African Americans were given a copy of Shakespeare and asked detailed questions. So, between these strategies, they suppressed the non-white vote so that the basic electorate, and especially in these states, were almost exclusively white and supported what was the establishment at the time. Now, what was the establishment? Well, oddly enough, the Republicans were the party of the North, the party of the industrialists, the party of the trading people, the party of the banks, the party of the railroad barons, and so on and so forth. The Democrats were the party of the unrequited Southern white former Confederates and really neo-Confederates. So during this whole Jim Crow period, which lasted from 1877, was formalized, and I don't know the year, but there was a separate but equal Supreme Court decision. And it was pretty much struck down in the 1950s with Brown versus the Board of Education in Little Rock, Arkansas. And basically they said there's no such thing as separate but equal. And that basically burgeoned. The civil rights movement was already going strong by then, really started during World War II with the Pullman car workers union and the train conductors union and people like that. And then they desegregated the armed forces so that every race could be in the armed forces and would have to work together. That was a big step forward. That was under Truman. So that would be 1948, 49, 50. Then actually it was Eisenhower, Republican, who desegregated the schools in Little Rock. And by the time of the Kennedy administration, there were demonstrations all over the place. And I kind of left out the bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama, which made Martin Luther King now a person who is honored with his own holiday early in January every year, famous, and who kind of became the mainstream manager of the civil rights movement. So all of that was going on. It was the 1960s, a tremendous amount of unrest, a whole new economy. And what people don't realize is there was also a gigantic and very significant Cold War, which was threatening the world with nuclear annihilation, against communists that said everybody was equal and let's take away all the power from the owners and give it to the proletariat, when in fact they gave it to themselves as apparatchiks of the government. They took over Cuba. There was tremendous amounts of unrest. The non-aligned movement was going strong. There was tremendous amounts of decolonization. The British Empire fell apart and gave independence to state after state, some of which became socialist, some of which became communist, some of which stayed nationalist. And the French Empire, the French fought to keep their empire and lost it in Algeria and Vietnam and places like that. And we eventually got embroiled in the Vietnam, which was split between communists in the north and non-communists. It's hard to say what they were in the south of Vietnam. So all of this was the context, the world context of the civil rights movement in the United States. And the civil rights movement was very embarrassing to the United States of America abroad, because it gave a propaganda point to the Russians, and a valid one, that here's America, here is the nation of freedom, here is the nation that tells you that you should have the freedom of assembly, the freedom to vote, the freedom to speak freely, the freedom to have your own media, which I'm exercising right now. And we have segregation in the South. And we have an underclass that's divided by, of all things, race, the absolute most invalid separator between citizens, that citizens of one race born on this soil, descendants of slaves, would have fewer rights and not even be able to go to the same lunch counter as people who also are born on that same soil, who just happen to have a different color skin, a white skin, or at least pink skin color. So this was humiliating. America was just getting beaten to a pulp propagandistically in Latin America and Africa and Asia, wherever you went. Japanese people were thinking, well, what do they think about me? What if I go to Dallas? Am I going to be able, do I have to go to a different bathroom, because I have a different color skin? What's wrong with these Americans? Who says they believe in freedom? So Kennedy was assassinated. Johnson took over, and Johnson was a former majority leader of the Senate and a tremendously powerful, excellent litigator or legislator. And he brought together a coalition that once and for all said, we are going to desegregate. We are going to have, we're going to formalize the 14th Amendment, which says equal rights for all, and Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of anyone, of citizens to vote. And we are just going to pull this whole thing together. And among the laws that they put together were the Voting Rights Act. Well, the Voting Rights Act is a little weird because it treats different states differently. And there's a pretty good reason for it. And the reason for it is these states had segregation. These states went out of their way to pass laws that specifically prevented people of a different race from being allowed to vote, from being allowed to register. And it worked. There was, I believe in one state, the disparity and percentage of voting was 48%, which means one group as 70% and the other group as 10 or 60%. So it was ridiculous, and it was a great thing that it was stopped. And I personally am for the Voting Rights Act. Now, the Voting Rights Act had bail-in and bail-out, which gets a little complicated. But the whole idea was that no state is allowed to pass any law that abridges people of a different color from voting. And that in certain areas, and these areas are specifically south of the Mason-Dixon line, Arizona, where the minority at that time were Latinos and Indians or Native Americans, and Alaska, where the minority were Native Americans too. So, and however, there was informal segregation all over the North and so on and so forth. And in the late 60s and early 70s, there were riots all over the place. And race riots as late as 1991 in Los Angeles. Very, very famous one, Rodney King. So what was the result? The result was that at least in those states, if they changed the voting law, they had to pre-clear it with the Justice Department, and there was a department of the Justice Department who's set up to make sure that any change in the law does not impact the right of one group or another to vote. So meanwhile, in 2012, and 2012 was just, it really started in 2000, 2004, 2008, and so on and so forth. There was just incredible voter suppression. And what do I mean by voter suppression? Well, we have early voting. The Republicans and I left out one thing. After Johnson, the Dixiecrats from the South were invited to join the Republican Party and switch parties by Nixon. And then by the time Reagan was there, the South was solidly Republican. And pretty much since then, the South, Texas, Florida, and so on and so forth have been solidly Republican. However, in these areas, just like in Arizona and other places, the European Americans are getting to be a smaller and smaller percentage of the population, and eventually, in some states, already a majority minority, which is kind of a silly phrase, but it means that between a minority of African Americans, Latin Americans, Asian Americans, Native Americans, and all these different groups, that all the different groups are more than 50%. So the demography is changing. And there are a lot of people, especially in the Republican Party, that is really the Republican Party that's really gone Dixiecrat, who say, we've got to do something about this because we're just going to get voted out of existence. And sure enough, I forgot what the margin was among blacks. It was like 80%, or the African Americans voted, I believe, in the 90% for the Democrats. So there's like a margin of 80%. But even the Latin Americans voted, I think, at least 30% or 40% more to the Democrats than to the Republicans. So some Republicans are saying we've got to ease up on all this anti-immigrant and anti-Mexican rhetoric, and we've got to open ourselves up. But meanwhile, there's been this voter suppression. Well, what's the voter suppression? Florida is a good example of it. The first thing they did was any ex-felon can never vote. And that alone, and because just the way the laws are enforced, African Americans who were found with a joint or something or a little bit of pot, get 3 years in prison, and Anglo Americans are just kind of their case is dismissed or something like that. There's not really equal equal justice, so that you end up with a lot more felons who are African Americans or Latin Americans than you do felons that are white, at least in proportion to the population. Probably in the prison, it's pretty even, but there's a much bigger white population, so the percentage is smaller. So if that had happened, a certain amount, I think it was 200,000 African Americans and Latin Americans would lose their franchise, not be able to vote at all, not be able to appeal to try to get their vote back, and simply can't vote no matter what, ever. And then they would, the other suppression was they would have voter purges. So anybody in a certain set of zip codes or precincts, usually African American or Latin American or Asian American, whose name was Smith or Washington, had the same name as a felon, would be taken off the voter rolls, and they would be sent a letter that they may or may not see, or maybe think it's junk mail. And basically it says, prove you are not this felon, or you won't be able to vote, instead of the government proving that you are. So that took away the franchise from people. But the most original was put out by ALEC, which is a conservative lobby group that basically wrote a set of laws that they wanted to pass in as many states as they could, and got Republicans to support it. And what they did was they said, what we need is voter ID, that you had to have a state-issued pictured card in order to go and vote. And of course, that doesn't apply to the largest non-standard voting method, which is absentee balloting. So absentee balloting by mail, by definition, you don't show your picture ID to vote. You send in your ballot, and that's a method that's preferred by Republicans and older European American people. So the African Americans, by and large, liked early voting. They would get together in their churches, and they'd bus them out to the polls on a Sunday, and then they would early vote, and they would get their exercise their franchise. So in Florida and in Pennsylvania, in Ohio, and in different places, they shortened the days that had early voting. They would not have early voting on Sunday, especially the Sunday before election. They didn't allow same-day registration. And in Florida, they went even farther and basically made it almost impossible to have a voter registration drive. Basically, if they didn't follow these very exacting regulations, the people who did the drive would be subject to imprisonment. So they basically shut down voter registration drives. So that is what we're talking about here. So once you get rid of preclearance, basically they said these particular states can enact any rule they can. Now, the other side can still go to Section 2. This is Section 4, which is the preclearance. Basically, all they did, and all the Justice Roberts did, was say, your map is no good. It's out of date. So write another map, and then you can have the Voting Rights Act. But what that did was say, we can't have preclearance anywhere, because now there is no map. So either Congress has got to pass a new map, which is unlikely with a Republican House of Representatives, and now the states get to pass whatever they want. So Texas, which had a very, very strict voter registration or voter ID act, has entire counties and areas that have no DMV, so you can't even get to, if you don't drive a car already, to a place to get your state voter ID. North Carolina passed the same thing. And Ohio and Pennsylvania already passed it, and they got frozen in their own state courts. So basically there's tremendous voter suppression. and nothing anybody can do much about. Thank you.